You've entered Void of Rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple. Subscribe. We're almost at 10,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's jump into today's story. The lamp flickered in the underground chamber, casting shadows that seemed to move with their own purpose. Dr. Daniel Ashford knelt beside the clay jar, his hands trembling as he brushed away centuries of accumulated dust. The seal was still intact, bronze, bearing the unmistakable mark of a Roman centurion. In all his years excavating the Holy Land, he'd never seen anything quite like this. The air down here tasted ancient, thick with the weight of secrets that had festered in darkness for 2,000 years. He would later remember this moment as the last time his hands were truly steady, the last time sleep came easily, the last time he could look at his reflection without seeing someone else staring back. 4 months earlier, the discovery had begun innocently enough. Daniel had been working in the caves east of Jerusalem with his local guide, Yusuf, a man whose family had explored these hills for 6 generations. They were documenting a known site, taking measurements and photographs for a survey that would likely end up in some dusty academic journal that 3 people would read. Standard work. Safe work. The kind of archaeology that didn't change anything. Then, Yusuf pressed his weathered hand against what appeared to be solid rock and felt air moving beneath his palm. "Dr. Ashford," he said quietly, his voice carrying that particular tone that makes an archaeologist's heart race. "Feel this." 2 days of careful excavation revealed the collapsed section. When they finally broke through, their flashlights illuminated something that made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. The chamber was small, barely large enough for a man to stand, and every surface was covered in scratch marks. Not the casual graffiti of bored explorers, but deep, desperate gouges in the stone. Someone had been sealed inside this place, and they had tried with bleeding fingers to claw their way out. The clay jar sat in the center of the chamber on a natural shelf of rock, placed with deliberate care. Its seal remained unbroken, a miracle that spoke of intentional preservation. When Daniel lifted it, the weight felt wrong, heavier than it should be, as if the contents carried more than physical mass. Inside, wrapped in decaying linen, they found 3 items. A scroll, its leather surface darkened by age but remarkably intact. A Roman military ring, the kind issued to auxiliary soldiers, bearing the inscription of the 10th Legion. And a small scrap of parchment with words written in Latin, the ink still dark after 2 millennia. Daniel translated it there in the chamber, his voice echoing off those scratched walls. "Let this remain hidden. For the sake of your soul, do not read what follows. Longinus." Yusuf had stepped back at that name, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "The centurion," he whispered. "The one who pierced Christ's side." Daniel had nodded, unable to speak, staring at the warning in his hands. Every instinct told him to reseal the jar, to collapse the tunnel, to walk away and forget they'd ever found this place. But he was a scholar, and scholars don't walk away from discoveries, so he'd carefully packed everything, filled out the proper documentation, and carried the jar back to his hotel room in Jerusalem's Old City. That was 4 months ago. Now Daniel sat in that same hotel room at 3 a.m, the scroll laid out on his work table under protective glass, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd slept for more than an hour without waking. The room had become his prison, stacks of reference books creating walls around his workspace, takeout containers forming archaeological layers of their own in the corner. The maid had stopped coming after he'd screamed at her for moving one of his translation notes. He addressed the camera directly, aware that he looked like a madman. His colleague from the university had set up the documentary equipment weeks ago, suggesting that Daniel document his translation process. Now those cameras captured a man who'd aged a decade in 4 months, dark circles hanging beneath his eyes like bruises, his hands shaking whenever they came near the scroll. "Imagine holding a document written by someone who stood at the foot of the cross," Daniel said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "We've just uncovered a lost scroll, an actual eyewitness testimony to the Crucifixion. Prepare for an unvarnished and raw account that brings you face to face with an event that shaped the world." He paused, his eyes drifting to the scroll behind him. "But I need you to understand something before we go further. Since I translated the first passage, 3 people have asked me to destroy it, and I'm starting to think they might be right." The scroll lay there under glass like a serpent coiled to strike. 3 distinct layers of writing overlapped and intertwined, each in a different language, each in a different hand, yet all telling the same story from angles that shifted like light through a prism. The leather itself seemed to resist examination, the words appearing to move when viewed peripherally, though Daniel knew that was impossible. He'd started seeing a lot of impossible things lately. Father Ephraim had been the first person Daniel called after securing the scroll. The Greek Orthodox priest was Jerusalem's foremost expert in ancient languages, a man who could read Aramaic dialects that had been dead for centuries and could parse the subtleties of Koine Greek that escaped most scholars. He'd arrived at Daniel's hotel room with his reading glasses and reference books, expecting routine work, perhaps an interesting administrative document or a mundane military record. The old priest had pulled a chair up to the table, adjusted his glasses and begun examining the scroll with practiced efficiency. Then his hands had started to shake. "Dr. Ashford," he'd said after 20 minutes of silent study, his accent thickening with emotion. "This man, he's writing like someone confessing before execution. But there's something else, something underneath the fear." Father Ephraim had looked up, his eyes wide. "He's writing like someone who's seen the face of God and can't unsee it." They'd worked together for 3 weeks, translating systematically, moving through the document, line by line. The author identified himself in the opening passage, written in precise military Latin. "I am Gaius Casca, soldier of Rome, veteran of 10 campaigns, executioner of the innocent. I write this so that someone might understand what I witnessed, though I pray to forgotten gods that no one ever does. If you are reading this, I have failed, and I have cursed you as I am cursed." Gaius Casca. The name meant nothing to most people, but Daniel had spent 3 sleepless days in the archives anyway, driven by the historian's need to verify, to ground the impossible in concrete fact. He'd found it buried in fragmentary Roman military records that most scholars dismissed as too damaged to be useful. Service record for Gaius Casca, auxiliary soldier, 10th Legion stationed in Jerusalem under Pontius Pilate from 29 to 33 CE. Requested emergency leave in April of 33. Never returned. Listed as deserter. Reward posted for capture. Then, nothing, as if the man had simply vanished from history. Except he hadn't vanished. He'd been writing. For 40 years, Gaius Casca had been writing, adding layer upon layer to his testimony, trying to find words adequate to describe what he'd witnessed on a hill outside Jerusalem on a Friday afternoon. Father Ephraim had noticed the strange preservation of certain passages, how some words seemed darker than others despite the uniform age of the leather. Those darker passages always described the same thing, the prisoner's eyes. "When he looked at us," Gaius had written, "it was like being seen for the first time in my life, like every secret I'd ever kept, every sin I'd ever committed, every moment of cowardice and cruelty was laid bare, and beneath that terrible exposure was something worse, understanding. forgiveness offered before it was asked for. That look destroyed me more than any condemnation could have. They translated Gaius's background first, the careful military record of a man who'd served for a decade in the legions. He'd fought in the Germanic campaigns under Germanicus, had seen true combat, had killed men in battle, and thought nothing of it. War was war. Death was part of the trade. He'd been posted to Judea as punishment for striking a superior officer who'd insulted his dead father, assigned to Governor Pilate's execution squad, because it was considered the worst duty available. Most soldiers avoided crucifixion detail if they could. The screams haunted you. The dying took hours, sometimes days. You stood there in the sun, watching men suffocate by inches, and something about that kind of death got under your skin in ways that clean battle never did. Gaius had crucified 17 men before the prisoner who changed everything. He recorded each one in his testimony with brutal honesty. Thieves, rebels, murderers, men whose names he'd never learned, and whose faces he'd forgotten within days. Routine executions, professional work performed with the detached efficiency of a craftsman who'd learned his trade well. Then came the 18th. They brought him to the praetorium before dawn, Gaius wrote. I was sharpening the spikes, routine preparation, not thinking about anything except finishing the job and getting back to wine and dice. Then I saw him. He was bruised from a night of questioning, his lip split, dried blood in his beard, but his eyes were clear. He looked at each of us, not with the fear I'd seen in every other condemned man, but with something I couldn't identify then. Now, after 40 years, I recognize it. Pity. He pitied us. He knew what we were about to do, and he pitied us for having to be the instruments of it. Father Ephraim had stopped reading at that point, removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Dr. Ashford, I need to take a break. But they'd both known he wasn't coming back. The priest had gathered his belongings and left, and Daniel had continued alone, driven by something he couldn't name, translating through the night while Jerusalem slept around him. The trial section revealed details that matched the biblical accounts, but added elements scripture had never recorded, small moments that only someone present would know. The way Pilate's hand had trembled when he signed the execution order, how he'd washed those hands afterward even though they bore no visible stain. The way Pilate's wife had appeared at the entrance to the judgment hall, her face pale as parchment, begging her husband to have nothing to do with that righteous man because she'd dreamed about him and woken screaming. The way the religious leaders had stood with their arms crossed, satisfied smiles on their faces, while the crowd they'd assembled shouted for blood. But it was the scourging that made Daniel understand why Longinus had sealed this testimony away with a warning. Gaius wrote about it with the detached precision of a soldier describing a military operation, but beneath that clinical language lay something rawer, something that bled through the careful words like blood through bandages. We made sport of it. That was standard. Condemned men were entertainment before they became corpses. We'd stripped him naked, tied him to the post, and I'd taken the flagrum, the whip with bone and metal woven into the leather straps. I'd used it before. I knew exactly how to make it hurt without killing. You wanted them alive for the crucifixion. Dead men couldn't suffer properly. The description that followed was detailed and horrible, but what haunted Daniel wasn't the physical brutality. It was what came after. We mocked him with a crown of thorns and a purple robe, Gaius wrote. Someone found a reed and shoved it in his hand like a scepter. We took turns kneeling before him, hailing him as king, then standing and striking him across the face. I hit him hard enough to split his cheek, and when I did, he looked at me with such sadness. Not for himself, for me. That look has never left me. Not for a moment in 40 years. I see it when I close my eyes. I see it in every reflective surface. I see it in the faces of strangers sometimes, and I have to look away before I start screaming. Then came the detail that made the hair on Daniel's arms stand up. He spoke to each of us by name, though we wore no identification. Called the centurion Longinus, though we'd never met him before that day. Called me Gaius, son of Casca the Elder, who died in the Rhine. Told me my father was at peace, that I should stop carrying guilt for not being there when he fell. How could a Judean carpenter know my father's name? How could he know about the guilt that had eaten at me for 23 years? How could he know anything about me at all? Daniel had verified that detail 3 more days, in archives tracking down military records from the Germanic campaigns. Casca the Elder, Centurion 19th Legion, killed in action along the Rhine in 10 CE, survived by one son, age 7. The dates matched perfectly. Either this was the most sophisticated forgery ever created, or Gaius Casca had been telling the absolute truth. Dr. Ruth Levy, a historian specializing in Roman military records, had reviewed Daniel's translations with the skeptical eye of a scholar trained to spot forgeries and embellishments. After 3 days of analysis, checking every detail against known historical records, she'd returned to his hotel room with a troubled expression that Daniel recognized. She'd found what she was looking for, and wished she hadn't. This level of specific detail is unprecedented in historical documents from this period, she'd said, spreading her notes across the table. The military terminology is perfect, using idioms that were only current for about 20 years before they changed. The names of officers match fragmentary records we have from that period. The description of equipment, procedures, even the slang the soldiers used, all of it checks out. Either this is authentic or someone with knowledge that shouldn't exist created it. And Dr. Ashford, I don't think anyone in the ancient world could have forged something this precise. Whoever wrote this was actually there. The walk to Golgotha occupied several sections of the scroll, and here Gaius's handwriting began to change. The careful military script became less controlled, words occasionally scratched out and rewritten, ink blots suggesting a hand that shook while writing. He described the journey through Jerusalem's streets in fragments that felt more like remembered nightmares than linear narrative. The crowds pressing in, some weeping, others mocking. Women wailing in that particular Middle Eastern way that sounded like keening birds. Children staring with wide eyes, not understanding what they were seeing, but knowing it was terrible. The religious leaders following at a careful distance, making sure the execution went forward, their satisfaction visible in the set of their shoulders. A man named Simon had been pulled from the crowd to carry the cross when the prisoner collapsed under its weight. He was from Cyrene, Gaius wrote, dark-skinned, powerful build, the kind of man who worked with his hands all his life. The prisoner had already carried the cross for half a mile, and the flogging had weakened him more than I'd intended. When he fell the 3rd time, Longinus grabbed this Simon and forced him to take it. The Cyrenean was terrified, convinced he'd be executed too just for being nearby. But the prisoner spoke to him, said something in a language I didn't know. Simon's face changed. He picked up that cross like it weighed nothing and carried it the rest of the way, tears streaming down his face, and I realized the prisoner had somehow given him strength, or peace, or something I couldn't name. But Gaius fixated on something else, something that clearly haunted him across the decades. The prisoner spoke to the women who were weeping for him, told them not to weep for him, but for themselves and their children, said that if they did these things when the wood was green, what would happen when it was dry? I didn't understand then. I thought it was the rambling of a dying man. Words without meaning. But as I write this, Jerusalem burns around me. The temple is ash. The streets run red. The Romans have destroyed everything, just as he said they would. It's been 40 years, and his words are coming true. He knew. Somehow standing there bleeding and brutalized, carrying the instrument of his own death, he knew exactly what was coming. Daniel had nearly dropped his magnifying glass when he had translated the date on that particular passage, 70 CE, 40 years after the Crucifixion. The same year Titus and the Roman legions had destroyed Jerusalem, burned the Second Temple, slaughtered hundreds of thousands. Gaius had been writing this testimony for 4 decades, returning to it again and again, adding layers of meaning as he tried to process what he'd witnessed. Father Ephraim had discovered margin notes in different handwriting before he'd abandoned the translation. Brief annotations in Greek, Latin, even a few in Aramaic. The madman Casca speaks truth. I was there also. I saw what he saw. May God forgive us all. Stephanos, former temple guard. Another note, this one in Latin. I carried his cross that day. What he gave me in that moment saved my life. I searched for years to thank him before I learned the truth. Now I search for forgiveness. Simon of Cyrene. A third in shaking Greek. I held the spear. I felt his blood on my hands. I heard him forgive his murderers, even as he died. I have never been the same. Longinus. Others had read this scroll. Others had added their own testimonies to its margins. They all confirmed Gaius's account, each from their own perspective, each carrying their own burden of having been present at that moment when, as Gaius wrote, heaven touched earth and earth broke under the weight. The crucifixion itself occupied the longest section of the scroll, and it was here that Daniel began to lose himself in the translation. He would sit at his desk for 18-20 hours at a stretch, forgetting to eat, forgetting to sleep, his eyes burning as he worked through passage after passage. Rebecca had called from Boston every day at first, then every few hours, her voice tight with worry that evolved into fear, and finally into a cold anger that said she was buying a plane ticket whether he wanted her to or not. Gaius described the technical process with a soldier's precision that made the horror more immediate rather than less. The nails were iron, longer than a man's hand, sharp enough to punch through flesh and bone without excessive effort. 3 of them for each execution, 1 through each wrist, angled to pass between the bones, and 1 through both ankles driven into the vertical post. The positioning of the body mattered. Too high and they died quickly from asphyxiation. Too low and they could push themselves up to breathe almost indefinitely. He wanted them at exactly the right height to maximize suffering while ensuring death within a day. Gaius had done this many times before. He described it the way a carpenter might describe building a table, each step following logically from the last. Professional work performed with the efficiency of experience. Lay the victim on the crossbeam, position the arms, drive the first nail through the left wrist, angling slightly to avoid the major bone. The screaming starts immediately, but you ignore it. You've heard it before. Drive the second nail through the right wrist. Hoist the crossbeam into position on the vertical post. Secure it. Position the feet, one over the other. Drive the third nail through both ankles into the post. Step back. Examine your work. Make sure everything is secure. But then, something changed in Gaius's writing. The careful professional script dissolved into something frantic. Words scratched deeper into the leather with obvious force. I have crucified many men. They curse, they plead, they weep. They pray to their gods for deliverance that never comes. They spit at us if they can reach. They threaten us with revenge in the afterlife. They bargain, offering money they don't have, begging for their families, asking for just one more day, one more hour, one more breath. I've heard every variation of human desperation, and I learned long ago to close my ears to it. Suffering means nothing if you have to listen to it all day. But this one was different. This one prayed. Not for himself, not for deliverance, He prayed for us, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." I drive nails through a man's wrists and he asks his God to forgive me. I am the instrument of his murder and he's praying for my soul. The sign above the cross read, "King of the Jews," in 3 languages, Pilate's final insult to the religious leaders who demanded this execution. 2 thieves were crucified on either side, one mocking the prisoner between them, demanding that if he was really the Messiah, he should save himself, and them too. The other thief, surprisingly, had defended him. "We deserve this," he'd said, his voice rasping with pain. "We're getting what our actions earned, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he turned his head towards the prisoner and said something that Gaius recorded carefully. "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And the prisoner, hanging there with nails through his wrists and ankles, struggling for every breath, had responded, "Today you will be with me in paradise." That broke something in me, Gaius wrote, the certainty in his voice. He was dying the same death as those thieves, suffering the same agony, experiencing the same humiliation, and yet he spoke of paradise like a king granting audience, like the nails and the cross were temporary inconveniences, like death itself was just a doorway he was about to walk through. I've seen many men die. I've never seen anyone die like that. Then came the darkness, and Gaius's handwriting dissolved into near illegibility. The sky darkened at noon, not clouds moving in, not a storm brewing. The light simply failed. One moment the sun was beating down on us, heat radiating off stone and sand, and the next moment we were standing in twilight. Except it wasn't twilight. Twilight is gentle, gradual, natural. This was abrupt and wrong, like someone had thrown a blanket over the world. And in that darkness, something happened that I cannot fully explain even now, 40 years later, with all the wisdom age has supposedly brought me. I felt the weight of every sin I'd ever committed pressing down on my chest, every lie I'd told, every moment of cruelty, every time I'd chosen convenience over compassion, every person I'd hurt through action or inaction, all of it accumulated over 34 years of life, suddenly present and accounted for. I couldn't breathe. The weight was crushing me. I fell to my knees in the dirt, and I wasn't alone. Other soldiers did the same. Longinus, the centurion who'd commanded 20 campaigns without flinching, was weeping like a child. Daniel had stopped translating at that point, his hands shaking too badly to hold the magnifying glass. It was 4 a.m. The hotel room felt too small, the walls pressing in. He'd gone to the window and opened it, breathing in Jerusalem's night air, trying to clear his head, but the words stayed with him, the weight of every sin pressing down. He'd felt something similar while translating, a growing heaviness in his chest that made breathing difficult, and he'd convinced himself it was just anxiety, just the stress of working too hard for too long. But reading Gaius's description, he wondered if it was something else, if the scroll itself carried some echo of that moment, some residual burden that transferred to anyone who engaged deeply with the testimony. He'd forced himself to continue. I heard my mother's voice, though she was dead 15 years. She was calling my name the way she had when I was a child and had done something wrong. Not angry, disappointed, sad that I'd chosen this path. Others heard voices too. Silvanus heard his brother, who died in the Germanic Wars. Marcus heard his wife, dead in childbirth 3 years prior. We were all hearing the dead, and they were all asking us the same question. How did you become this? When did you stop being the person you could have been? The darkness lasted 3 hours, according to Gaius. 3 hours during which something fundamental about reality seemed to suspend. Men saw visions of their dead. They heard accusations in languages they didn't speak, voices speaking their deepest secrets, their most carefully hidden shames. They felt presences in the darkness, neither hostile nor comforting, simply there, bearing witness to what was happening on that hill outside Jerusalem. And through it all, the prisoner hung on his cross, still conscious, still aware. Gaius recorded that the prisoner spoke several times during those hours. To his mother, standing at the foot of the cross, weeping. To a young man with her, entrusting her to his care. To the thief beside him, offering paradise. Words of comfort and care even while experiencing agony that should have made speech impossible. Then, near the end, the prisoner had cried out. Gaius recorded it phonetically in Latin first, then provided his own translation. Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? His voice was not angry, Gaius wrote, not afraid. It was the sound of complete abandonment, of divine loneliness, of bearing something no being should ever bear alone, of standing in the darkness and finding even God had turned away. And then the earth itself responded in the only way it could. It broke. The earthquake. Gaius described it with the visceral detail of someone who'd experienced terror in its purest form. The ground heaving under their feet, soldiers falling, unable to stand, rocks splitting with sounds like thunder, tombs opening, not metaphorically, but literally stone covers sliding aside as the ground shifted and heaved. People running in all directions convinced the end of the world had come, and in that moment, Gaius wrote, he'd believed they were right. I looked up at the prisoner. He was still, too still. I'd seen enough death to recognize it. Longinus ordered me to verify it. Standard procedure when death came quickly. Break the legs if they're still alive, make sure they can't push themselves up to breathe. But he was already dead, so Longinus ordered the spear thrust instead. Insurance, proof for Pilate that the job was done. Gaius described taking the spear from Longinus's hands, approaching the cross, positioning the tip. The thrust itself professional and efficient, angled up between the ribs. Then something happened that Gaius struggled to articulate even in 3 different languages. Blood and water poured out. I've seen many men die. This was death, complete and final. But when that blood touched my hands, I felt something break inside me. Not physically, deeper than that. Like a door opening that should have remained closed forever. Like becoming aware of a weight I'd been carrying my entire life but had never noticed until that moment. The weight of being human in a world where humans do terrible things to each other. The weight of being complicit in systems of violence. The weight of being the hands that killed God. Gaius had returned to the barracks but couldn't sleep. He'd gone to the washing station and scrubbed his hands until they bled, but the stain wouldn't come clean. He could still see it, dark and accusing, though his fellow soldiers assured him there was nothing there. He'd stared at his hands in the lamplight, seeing blood that wasn't physically present but was somehow more real than any substance he'd ever touched. The body was removed by a wealthy man named Joseph of Arimathea and a Pharisee called Nicodemus, both secret followers of the prisoner according to Gaius's intelligence reports. They'd handled the corpse with reverence, wrapping it in expensive linen and expensive spices, the kind of burial usually reserved for kings. Guards were posted at the tomb. Silvanus was among them, cursing his bad luck, hoping for an uneventful shift. 3 days later, the tomb was empty, and Silvanus was a shattered man. Gaius recorded the guard's testimony with the precision of someone taking a military report. They'd been at their posts alert and sober when an earthquake struck just before dawn. A figure clothed in light so bright it hurt to look at directly had appeared at the tomb entrance. The stone, which required multiple men to move, had rolled aside as if it weighed nothing. The tomb was empty. The grave clothes were folded neatly, as if someone had simply gotten up from sleep and straightened the bed before leaving. The guards had run back to the praetorium in terror. Gaius saw their faces. He knew these men. He'd served with them for years. They weren't prone to fantasy or exaggeration. They'd seen combat. They'd faced death without flinching. But something at that tomb had broken them at a fundamental level. Silvanus's face was chalk white. His hands shook so badly he couldn't hold his spear. The others were in similar states, seasoned soldiers reduced to stammering, terrified wrecks. I asked Silvanus what he'd seen. He opened his mouth to answer, and no sound came out, just this rasping noise like his voice had been scraped away. He tried again, and this time managed 2 words. He rose. Then he turned and walked away, and I never saw him again as the man I'd known. The priests arrived within the hour. Money changed hands. The official story was established. The disciples had stolen the body while the guards slept. But Gaius knew it was a lie. Roman guards didn't sleep on duty, and if they had, how would they know what happened while unconscious? The explanation satisfied no one, except those who desperately needed to believe it. Gaius knew the truth because of what happened to him 3 nights later. I saw him. In my quarters, 3 nights after his death. I was alone, sitting on my cot, staring at my hands in the lamplight, still seeing that blood that wouldn't wash away. Then he was there. Not a ghost, not a vision. Solid. Real. More real than anything else in the room. The wounds were still visible, in his hands and side, but they weren't bleeding. He stood there looking at me, with those same eyes that had seen through me in the Praetorium. And he spoke my name, not angry, not accusing, just sad. Sad that I had to carry this. He said I would carry the memory of that day, until I chose to release it. Said I must write it all down. That others must understand what happened when heaven touched earth, and earth could not bear it. That someone needed to preserve the testimony of the instruments, not just the witnesses. That the hammers needed to tell their story too. Then he was gone, and I was alone with the lamp, and my guilt and the growing understanding that my life was over, even though I was still breathing. Daniel had translated that passage at dawn, the sun rising over Jerusalem, as he read about a dead man walking and speaking in a Roman soldier's quarters. He should have been skeptical. He should have dismissed it as the delusion of a traumatized mind. But something about Gaius's precise, careful description made it feel true. The man wasn't writing metaphor. He was recording what he'd experienced as accurately as language allowed. 6 months later, Gaius Casca walked away from his post and never returned. The military records confirmed it. One day he simply disappeared, leaving behind his equipment, his pay, his entire identity as a Roman soldier. Daniel had spent weeks tracing what happened next, following fragmentary references through historical documents like following breadcrumbs through a dark forest. A letter from the Christian community in Rome, dated to 48 CE, 15 years after the crucifixion, mentioned the soldier who crucified the Lord, seeking baptism. The community leaders had refused him, convinced his presence was a trap set by the authorities. He'd left weeping, and they never saw him again. Daniel found the detail that made this identification certain. The letter mentioned the soldier had showed them his hands, claiming he could still feel the hammer's weight even though he held nothing. A record from Corinth in 52 CE described a Roman deserter who attended synagogue services despite being Gentile, sitting in the back and weeping throughout the readings. When confronted by the rabbi, he'd said he was searching for forgiveness but couldn't find it because his sin was too great to be forgiven. The rabbi had told him no sin was beyond God's forgiveness, and the man had responded, "I killed God. How do you forgive that?" An account from Ephesus in 61 CE told of a mad soldier who wandered the streets carrying a scroll and forcing people to read it. Those who read it reported terrible dreams afterward, visions of crucifixion that felt more like memories than nightmares. The city authorities had driven him out. and he'd moved on to the next city, carrying his testimony like a burden he couldn't set down but needed desperately to share. The most disturbing reference came from Alexandria in 89 CE, 56 years after the Crucifixion. A church leader named Clement had written a letter describing a meeting with the wanderer Casca, who has lived beyond his years by some curse or miracle. Clement described a man who should have been in his 80s or 90s but looked older than time itself. His eyes were ancient with sorrow, Clement wrote. He showed me his hands. They bore no scars, yet he claimed to feel the nails every day, to feel the hammer's weight in his palm, to hear the sound of iron punching through flesh and bone. He said he'd tried to die many times but couldn't. Said he was cursed to wander until someone understood what he'd witnessed, what he'd been, what he'd done. The last confirmed sighting was in 110 CE, 77 years after the Crucifixion. Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, wrote about meeting the soldier Casca, who bore witness to the crucifixion through his presence at it, who has wandered the earth for longer than any man should live, seeking something he cannot name. Polycarp had asked if he wanted baptism, and Gaius had responded that he'd been baptized 7 times in 7 different cities, and it never took. The water washes away nothing, he told Polycarp. The blood remains, I see it always. I will see it until I stop seeing anything at all. Then the trail went cold. The scroll suggested Gaius had returned to Jerusalem, to the caves where Daniel had found his final testimony, sealed in clay. He'd died there, alone in darkness, still trying, after 40 years, to make sense of one afternoon's work that had destroyed him more thoroughly than any enemy blade could have. But the scroll's journey hadn't ended with Gaius's death. Daniel discovered that it had been found in his belongings and passed to the early Christian community in Jerusalem. What followed was a trail of tragedy that stretched across 2 millennia, and the more Daniel researched it, the more he understood why Longinus had sealed it away with a warning. A letter from 130 CE mentioned the testimony of the executioner being read aloud in secret meetings of the Jerusalem church. Several of those who heard it went mad within days, claiming to experience the crucifixion through Gaius's memories. One man tried to drive nails through his own wrists, screaming that he needed to feel what he'd made Christ feel. Another stopped eating, saying he didn't deserve to live. The church leaders stopped reading it publicly and locked it away. The scroll surfaced in Antioch in 190 CE. Bishop Serapion, known for his scholarly approach and skeptical mind, decided to translate it properly and analyze its theological implications. He worked on it for 3 weeks. His deacons reported that he stopped sleeping, stopped eating, spent all his time with the scroll muttering in languages they didn't recognize. On the 22nd day, he stood up from his desk, walked calmly to his quarters and set himself on fire. His final words screamed as the flames consumed him. I have seen through the eyes of the damned. I have felt the weight of deicide. Let this testimony be sealed away forever. It wasn't sealed away. It disappeared for 200 years, then resurfaced in Constantinople in 547 CE. A monastery housed it in their scriptorium. 3 monks were assigned to copy it for preservation, standard practice for important documents. They worked in shifts, each spending hours with the scroll. After 7 days, the monastery burned. The fire started in the scriptorium, which was locked from the inside. All 3 monks died. Witnesses reported hearing screaming from the locked room, but by the time they broke down the door, there was only fire and smoke, and the bodies of 3 men who'd clawed at the door until their fingers broke. The scroll survived. It always survived. It vanished during the Crusades, lost in the chaos of conquest and slaughter. When it reappeared, it was 1347, discovered in a German monastery that had been mysteriously abandoned. The monks had simply walked away one day, leaving everything behind. Their last diary entry reading, The testimony must not be read. We were wrong to preserve it. We go now to find peace in silence. The scroll was found in their scriptorium, left open on a reading stand, and that same year the Black Death arrived in that region of Germany. Pope Clement VI ordered the scroll sealed in 1348 after reading a Latin translation. His private letters, discovered in the Vatican archives centuries later, revealed what he'd experienced. I read the testimony of the soldier Casca for 3 hours. When I finished, I could not remember who I was. I looked at my hands and saw blood. I heard screaming, but the room was silent. I felt the weight of every sin ever committed, pressing down on me until I could not stand. This testimony bears a weight that crushes the soul. It is authentic, I believe, which makes it more dangerous than any heresy. It shows us the crucifixion not as divine mystery, but as brutal murder, and forces us to reckon with what that means. It makes us complicit. It makes us the hammers and the nails. Better it remains hidden. Better no one else feels what I have felt. The scroll was lost during the Reformation, presumably destroyed or stolen when Protestant forces sacked Catholic monasteries across Europe. Daniel had assumed it was gone forever, burned or rotting in some forgotten cellar. Until Yusuf felt air moving behind solid stone in a cave east of Jerusalem. Rebecca arrived from Boston on a Monday evening, took one look at Daniel and physically recoiled. He'd lost 20 pounds. His eyes were sunken. His skin had taken on an unhealthy pallor, and his hands shook constantly. The hotel room smelled of old food and unwashed clothes and something else, something like desperation fermented into physical presence. "Daniel," she said, her voice carefully controlled in that way that meant she was barely holding back panic. "What is this thing doing to you?" He tried to explain, tried to tell her about Gaius Casca and the testimony and the weight of bearing witness to something humanity was never meant to see up close. The words came out jumbled and frantic, and he could see in her face that she thought he was having some kind of breakdown. "You look like you've aged 10 years, she said. "You're not sleeping, you're not eating, you're barely making sense. This needs to stop." "I dream I'm there," Daniel admitted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I'm Gaius. I feel the hammer in my hand. I see his face looking up at me. And the worst part, Rebecca, the worst part is that in the dream, I'm not sorry. I'm just doing my job. I'm following orders. I'm not thinking about who he is or what this means. I'm thinking about getting it done so I can go back to the barracks and drink wine and play dice. And that makes it so much worse, the casual cruelty, the thoughtless violence, the fact that we... He stopped, his voice breaking. Rebecca had pulled him close, and he'd wept against her shoulder for the first time since finding the scroll. When he finally pulled away, his face was wet, and his hands had finally stopped shaking. "Some knowledge isn't meant to be shared," Rebecca said quietly. "Look what it's doing to you. Look what it did to everyone who encountered it. Maybe that's the real message here. Maybe Gaius spent 40 years trying to share a burden that can't be shared because it destroys anyone who tries to carry it." Father Ephraim had stopped attending translations weeks ago. Daniel had called him once, and the priest's voice had been different, flatter, emptied of something essential. "I cannot continue, Dr. Ashford. Last night I woke up speaking Aramaic, a language I do not speak fluently enough to dream in. I was praying the words Christ spoke on the cross, but it wasn't my voice. It was someone else's voice coming from my throat. I was not myself. Something in those words, something in that testimony, it pulls at something deep inside. It wants to be experienced, not just read. It wants to transfer the burden from Gaius to anyone willing to engage with it. I won't let it take me. I'm entering monastery. I'm taking vows of silence. I need to stop speaking before I speak words that aren't mine." But Daniel had continued alone, driven by something he couldn't name or resist. He'd made a discovery in the final sections of the scroll, something Father Ephraim had missed in his hurry to escape. The three languages weren't just translations of each other. They formed a palimpsest, each layer revealing something the others concealed. And when read together, when all three were translated simultaneously and laid over each other like transparent sheets, they formed a message that Gaius had spent 40 years trying to articulate. Daniel worked through 3 sleepless nights to complete the final translation, his eyes burning, his hands cramping, his mind pushed to its absolute limits. When he finally read the complete message that Gaius had encoded in 3 languages across 4 decades, he understood why the scroll had left such destruction in its wake. The Latin was factual. What happened, when it happened, who was there, the precise record of a soldier reporting events with military efficiency. The Aramaic, written over the Latin in the same hand but years later, was emotional. The fear, the guilt, the desperate need for forgiveness, the weight of being the instrument of divine murder. The Greek, added last in a hand that shook with age, was comprehension, Gaius's final understanding of what he'd witnessed and what it meant. When read together, they formed this. I understood too late what I had witnessed. It was not simply a man who died that day on Golgotha. It was the moment when justice and mercy collided and became the same thing. When divine love touched human cruelty and did not recoil. When heaven bent down to earth and we broke it, and instead of destroying us in return, it absorbed the blow and forgave us for delivering it. I felt the weight of humanity's sin in that darkness, not just mine, but all of it, past and future, every moment of cruelty and violence and thoughtless evil that humans have inflicted on each other since the beginning. That is what killed him. Not the nails, not the cross, the weight of what he chose to carry, the burden of being the meeting point between divine justice and divine mercy. And I put him there. I am the hands humanity used to kill its God. I am the instrument of the most necessary and most terrible act in history. This is why I cannot die. This is why I cannot forget. This is why you who read this will never forget either. You are witness now, as I was witness. You stand where I stood. You feel what I felt. And the burden passes to you because some truths are too heavy to carry alone, but too important to bury. Forgive me for what I have done to you by making you read this, but someone must understand. Someone must remember. Someone must carry it forward. And now that someone is you. Daniel sat back from his desk, his vision blurring, his chest tight. The hotel room felt like it was spinning. He understood now why people went mad after reading this, why monks set themselves on fire, why a pope had ordered it sealed away. The testimony didn't just tell you about the crucifixion, it made you complicit in it. It transferred the burden of bearing witness from Gaius to the reader. It made you feel the hammer in your hand. It made you responsible. He looked down at his own hands and saw blood that wasn't there. It was 3 a.m. when Daniel made his decision. The hotel room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sounds of Jerusalem traffic. He turned on the camera, positioned himself in frame, and began to speak, his voice hoarse but steady. Gaius Casca spent 40 years trying to make sense of what he experienced. He wrote and rewrote this account, layering language over language, trying to find words adequate to describe the indescribable. And in the end, he sealed it in a cave and asked that it remain hidden. Not because it's false, but because it's too true. Because the truth it contains is too heavy for human minds to bear. Because reading it doesn't just inform you about history, it makes you part of that history. It transfers the burden of witness from him to you. He paused, looking directly into the camera. I keep thinking about something Gaius wrote in the margins of the final page. Some truths are too heavy for mortal minds. We were never meant to stand that close to the divine. We were never meant to see what I saw, to know what I know, to carry what I carry. If you are reading this, I have failed you. I have cursed you as I am cursed, and I am sorrier for that than for anything else I have ever done. Daniel there reached over and turned off the camera. The decision was made. The meeting took place 3 days later in a conference room beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the traditional site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. Daniel had chosen the location deliberately. If they were going to decide the fate of Gaius's testimony, it should happen as close as possible to where that testimony began. He'd requested the presence of religious leaders from multiple traditions, and they'd all come. The Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem, an elderly man whose eyes held the weight of decades of spiritual authority, the Catholic Archbishop, younger but carrying himself with the same grave dignity, a Protestant minister who served the English-speaking community, practical and thoughtful, and Rabbi Goldstein, whose family had been scholars of ancient texts for 6 generations. Daniel laid out the scroll on the conference table, still sealed under protective glass. The religious leaders stood around it in silence, each seeming to feel something emanating from the ancient leather, though none would have admitted it aloud. He presented his findings methodically, the way he'd been trained. The discovery, the authentication, the translation, the verification of historical details, the trail of tragedy following this document through 2 millennia. He showed them copies of letters from bishops and monks who'd encountered it. He showed them the record of fires and madness and suicide that followed in its wake. When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. The Patriarch spoke first, his voice carrying the accent of someone who'd been speaking Greek longer than English. You have authenticated this beyond any doubt? Every test confirms it. Carbon dating places it between 33 and 40 CE. Linguistic analysis confirms the Latin is consistent with military documents from that period. Historical details check out against Roman records. This is genuine. Then you will publish? The Archbishop asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. No, Daniel's voice was firm. I'm asking you to help me seal it away. Rabbi Goldstein leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel with eyes that had evaluated countless scholars over the years. You would bury perhaps the most significant archaeological discovery of the century, the only known eyewitness account of the crucifixion. I would protect people from a burden they shouldn't have to carry. Daniel gestured to the scroll. Gaius Casca spent 40 years being destroyed by what he witnessed. Father Ephraim is in a monastery under vows of silence because he started speaking in voices that weren't his own. I haven't slept more than 2 hours at a time in 4 months. My wife thinks I'm having a breakdown, and maybe I am. This scroll doesn't just tell us about the crucifixion, it makes us experience it. It transfers Gaius's burden to anyone who engages deeply with it, and that burden breaks people. The minister, whose name was Pastor Williams, leaned forward with his hands clasped on the table. But don't we have an obligation to truth, to history, to understanding what actually happened that day? We have an obligation to wisdom, Daniel countered, and sometimes wisdom means recognizing that some knowledge comes at too high a price. Gaius knew this. He sealed his testimony away with a warning. Longinus knew it. He added his own warning. Pope Clement VI knew it. Every generation that encountered this scroll tried to contain it or destroy it. Maybe we should listen to them instead of assuming we're smarter or stronger or more capable of handling it than they were. The Patriarch and Archbishop exchanged glances, and Daniel saw something pass between them, some understanding that came from centuries of religious tradition, dealing with mysteries that transcended simple truth or falsehood. The Orthodox Church has traditions of such things, the Patriarch said slowly. Sacred texts too powerful for general knowledge, prayers that should not be spoken lightly, rituals that should not be performed except under specific circumstances. The assumption that all knowledge should be freely available is a modern one. Our ancestors understood that some truths require preparation, spiritual maturity, protection. Perhaps this testimony belongs in that category. The Archbishop nodded. The Vatican archives contain documents that are sealed for similar reasons, not because they threaten faith, but because they could harm those who encounter them unprepared. If what you're describing is accurate, Dr. Ashford, then this scroll falls into that classification. Rabbi Goldstein was quieter, his expression troubled. As a scholar, this troubles me deeply. As a man of faith, as someone whose people have carried heavy truths for 4,000 years, I understand the weight of bearing witness. But Dr. Ashford, are you certain? Once sealed, this may be lost forever. Future generations may never have the chance to encounter it. Not forever. Daniel had thought this through carefully during his sleepless nights. 100 years. Seal it for a century. Let this documentary serve as the only public record of its contents. Maybe in 2125, humanity will have developed the spiritual and psychological tools to engage with this testimony without being destroyed by it. Or maybe they'll decide, as we're deciding now, that it should remain sealed. Either way, we give them the choice. We don't destroy it. We just contain it until a generation wiser than ours can decide what to do with it. They discussed details for another hour. Security arrangements, the physical location of the vault, who would have access, how the decision would be transmitted to their successors, what would happen if someone tried to steal it or force it open. Daniel watched them work, these leaders of different faiths finding common ground in their shared recognition that some burdens were too heavy for individual shoulders. Finally, they reached agreement. The scroll would be placed in a joint vault, constructed specifically for this purpose. The location would be known only to the highest levels of each tradition. It would be sealed with ceremony and protected by both physical security and sacred sanction. In 100 years, in 2125, their successors would gather in the same room beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and decide whether to unseal it. The sealing ceremony took place on a Friday afternoon, and Daniel appreciated the symbolism, even if no one mentioned it aloud. They'd brought a stone box, ancient limestone that dated back to the Second Temple period, acquired from a museum with the explanation that it was needed for preservation purposes. The scroll would rest in a container from the same era it described. The underground chamber was lit by candles despite the presence of electric lights. Incense filled the air, multiple types layered over each other, creating a scent that was both ancient and immediate. The religious leaders wore their formal vestments, and Daniel felt underdressed in his simple suit, but they'd insisted he be present for the sealing. He'd found the testimony. He'd made the decision to contain it. He should see it through to the end. The patriarch prayed in Greek, his voice resonating off the stone walls with the weight of liturgy that stretched back to the earliest days of Christianity. The Archbishop followed with Latin benedictions, words that had been spoken over relics and sacred objects for centuries. Pastor Williams read from Psalms, choosing passages about bearing burdens and finding rest. Rabbi Goldstein chanted in Hebrew, his voice carrying melodies that predated the crucifixion itself, prayers from a tradition that had given birth to the man whose death Gaius had witnessed. Then, together, they lifted the scroll and placed it in the stone box. Daniel watched it disappear into the ancient limestone, and he felt something release in his chest, a weight he'd been carrying for 4 months, lifting incrementally. With each inch, the scroll descended into its container. He spoke the final words, the ones they'd agreed he should say. Gaius Casca wrote that he was cursed to remember, but maybe the real curse would be for all of us to remember the way he did, to feel what he felt in that moment when heaven touched earth and he held the hammer that drove divinity into wood, to carry what he carried for 40 years until it broke him completely. Some witnessed the crucifixion and came away with faith. Gaius witnessed it and came away with trauma. Perhaps the difference is that he was the instrument. He wasn't just present. He was complicit. He was the hands that did the work. And no one should have to live with being the hands that killed God. The lid was placed on the stone box, heavy limestone grinding against limestone. The seals were applied, wax and lead and sacred symbols from 4 different traditions. The box was placed in the vault, and the vault door was closed with a sound of finality that echoed through the chamber like a bell tolling. Above the vault, masons carved an inscription in 4 languages: Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic, so that no matter who found this place in the future, they would understand what it contained. Here lies the testimony of Gaius Casca, soldier of Rome, witness to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, written in his own hand across 40 years as he tried to comprehend what he had experienced, sealed by those who understood that some truths are too heavy to be carried lightly. May he rest in peace. May all who read this respect the wisdom of those who sealed it away. Let it remain closed until those who come after us have the strength to bear what it contains. The date was carved below, April 15th, 2025, and below that the date when the seal could be broken, April 15th, 2125. Daniel stood outside afterward, Jerusalem sunshine warming his face after hours in the cool underground chamber. He looked older. Rebecca had pointed it out that morning, grey threading through his hair that hadn't been there 6 months ago, lines around his eyes that made him look 50 instead of 42. But his hands were steady now. The trembling had stopped. The dreams had faded. Whatever burden the scroll had tried to transfer to him was contained again, sealed behind stone and prayer and time. Rebecca stood beside him, her hand in his, and they watched the workers seal the entrance to the chamber with new stone. In a few weeks it would be indistinguishable from the rest of the church's foundation. Only 5 people in the world would know it existed. "Will you be able to let it go?" Rebecca asked quietly. "I still think about him sometimes," Daniel admitted. Gaius Casca, soldier of Rome, who spent 40 years trying to understand one Friday afternoon. One terrible, beautiful, impossible day when the divine broke into reality, and he was standing there with iron and wood and orders to execute a prisoner. Maybe in another century humanity will have developed the psychological and spiritual tools to engage with his testimony without being destroyed by it. He paused. But I don't think so. Some truths are too heavy, some memories too sharp, some moments too sacred and terrible to share. Maybe Gaius understood that at the end. Maybe that's why he sealed it in a cave and asked that it remain hidden. Not to suppress truth, but to protect people from a burden they shouldn't have to carry. They walked away from the church together, leaving the vault behind, leaving Gaius's testimony to its century of darkness, leaving the burden where it belonged, witnessed but not shared, remembered but not relived. 3 months later, the documentary aired at 2 a.m. on an obscure cable channel that specialized in religious programming. Daniel had fought for that time slot, arguing that if the scroll itself was too dangerous to release, then even a documentary about it should be treated with caution. Let it reach those who were genuinely interested, rather than those just channel surfing. It received modest viewership. A few thousand people, mostly insomniacs and night shift workers and seminary students, researching their theses. The response was mixed. Most scholars dismissed it as an elaborate hoax despite Daniel's reputation. The production values were too low, they said. The story too convenient. A Roman soldier who converted to Christianity would be claimed by every tradition, wanting to legitimize themselves. The lack of access to the actual scroll made verification impossible. Some pointed to the trail of tragedy as evidence that the whole thing was fabricated legend, grown more dramatic with each retelling across centuries. The religious community was more divided. Some called it blasphemy, claiming it cheapened the sacred mystery of the crucifixion by trying to explain it through human psychology and trauma. Others found it deeply moving, a reminder that real people had been present at that moment, that history happened through human hands and human choices. Most simply weren't sure what to make of it, finding the story compelling, but too strange to fully accept or reject. Dr. Daniel Ashford returned to teaching at Boston University. His department welcomed him back with carefully neutral expressions that said they'd heard about his sabbatical and were reserving judgment on his mental state. He taught with the same passion he'd always brought to the classroom, but students noticed something different. He was more contemplative, more careful with his words. When discussing archaeological discoveries, he occasionally paused and seemed to be weighing something invisible before continuing. He spoke less about the importance of discovering everything, and more about the wisdom of knowing when to stop digging. He never spoke publicly about the scroll again. Journalists requesting interviews received polite refusals. Academic conferences that invited him to present his findings were declined with thanks but no explanation. When pressed by colleagues, he would simply say that some research produces conclusions that don't belong in journals or lecture halls. A few persistent reporters tracked him down at his office or his home, and he told them all the same thing. I found what I found. I've said what I needed to say. Now I'm letting it rest. His marriage to Rebecca grew stronger, as if the ordeal had burned away some superficial layer and left something more resilient beneath. They had 2 children in the years that followed, and Daniel was the kind of father who was fully present, who understood that moments with his children were more important than any discovery he might make in dusty archives. His son asked him once, when he was 8 years old, what the most important thing his father had ever found was. Daniel had thought for a long moment before answering, the wisdom to know when to walk away. Father Ephraim remained in his monastery in the mountains of Greece. He never broke his vow of silence, but he wrote extensively, filling journals with observations about faith and suffering and the weight of bearing witness. After his death at the age of 93, those journals were discovered by the monastery's abbot, who read them and then locked them away in the monastery's archives with a note, Father Ephraim's thoughts on the testimony of Gaius Casca, too heavy for general reading, restrict access to those specifically seeking understanding of traumatic witness. The journals contained a single repeated observation, written in various forms across 30 years. I saw through someone else's eyes for just a moment, and it nearly destroyed me. Gaius looked through those eyes for 40 years. How did he survive it? Or did he? Rabbi Goldstein lived another 15 years after the sealing. He never spoke publicly about the scroll, but in private conversations with trusted students, he would sometimes reference it as an example of the weight that comes with bearing witness. Our tradition has always understood that some knowledge requires preparation, he would say. The deepest mysteries are not hidden to keep us ignorant, but to protect us until we're ready to understand without being crushed by the understanding. That Roman soldier carried something he wasn't prepared for, and it destroyed him. May we all have the wisdom to know our own limitations. The documentary itself became a minor footnote in religious studies, occasionally referenced in papers about martyrdom and conversion narratives generally dismissed as apocryphal. A few scholars defended its authenticity, pointing to Daniel's reputation and the specificity of the historical details, but they were in the minority. Most simply filed it under interesting if true, and moved on to more verifiable research. But for those who watched it, who really paid attention to Daniel's face as he described translating the scroll, who heard the exhaustion and relief in his voice when he talked about sealing it away, there was something compelling about the story, something that felt true even if the facts couldn't be verified. A truth about trauma and witness, and the weight of carrying history in your bones. 5 years after the documentary aired, a graduate student writing her thesis on traumatic memory in religious contexts interviewed Daniel for her research. She asked him if he regretted sealing the scroll away, if he ever wished he'd published the full translation so others could study it. Daniel had thought for a long time before answering. Gaius Casca spent 40 years trying to share what he'd experienced. He wrote it in 3 languages, layering meaning over meaning, trying to find words that could carry the weight of that afternoon. And at the end of those 40 years, he sealed it in a cave with a warning. That should tell you something. Not that the truth shouldn't be known, but that some truths can't be shared without destroying the person receiving them. He learned that the hard way. I learned it by translating his words. Maybe the real wisdom is recognizing that learning something doesn't obligate you to teach it. The graduate student included that quote in her thesis. It won awards. She went on to become a psychologist, specializing in secondary trauma, the kind that affects people who hear traumatic stories from others. In her most cited paper, she referenced the Gaius Casca documentary as a case study in the transmission of trauma across time, noting that even a story about trauma can carry traumatic weight. The burden of witness, she wrote, doesn't end with the original witness. It can be passed on, shared, distributed among those who engage deeply with the testimony. This is why some traditions restrict access to traumatic narratives, not to suppress truth, but to protect those who aren't prepared to carry it. The years passed. Daniel grew older, grey turning to white, lines deepening around his eyes. He published papers on other subjects, led archaeological digs in other locations, mentored graduate students who went on to their own discoveries. But he never returned to the caves east of Jerusalem. When asked why, he said simply that he'd found what he was looking for there, and didn't need to go back. Rebecca asked him once, 10 years after the sealing, if he ever regretted the decision. They were sitting on their back porch watching their children play in the yard, and the question came out of comfortable silence rather than any particular context. Daniel watched his daughter push his son on the swing set, both of them laughing, and he thought about a Roman soldier who'd lived too long carrying too much, who'd wandered the empire trying to share a burden that couldn't be shared, who'd finally died alone in a cave still trying to make sense of one afternoon's work. No, he said finally. Gaius spent 40 years being destroyed by what he witnessed. I spent 4 months being damaged by translating his account of it. Father Ephraim spent 3 weeks on it and had to take a vow of silence. How long would it take for it to destroy someone who engaged with it casually? Someone who encountered it online, or in a book, or in a lecture hall without preparation or protection or understanding of what they were taking on? The scroll doesn't just inform, it transfers. It makes you complicit. It puts the hammer in your hand. Some burdens are too heavy to share that way. Do you still dream about it? Rebecca asked quietly. Sometimes, Daniel admitted, less now than before. When I do, it's not as vivid. More like a memory of a memory. Fading, the way traumatic memories eventually fade if you don't feed them. But I suspect Gaius dreamed about it every night for 40 years without fading, without relief, without any diminishment of the weight. That's the difference between reading about trauma and being present for it. Between translating someone's account and actually experiencing it yourself. Gaius was there. He felt the hammer in his hand. He saw the prisoner's face. He heard the words of forgiveness. He stood in that darkness and felt the weight of divine suffering. No translation can fully capture that, and thank God for it. if it could, if reading his words gave you the full experience of being there, nobody who read it would survive intact. Rebecca had taken his hand, and they'd sat in silence watching their children play, grateful for the ordinary moment, for the distance from that cave and that scroll, and that burden that waited in darkness for another generation to discover and decide whether to unseal. 20 years after the documentary aired, a new generation of scholars began researching the testimony of Gaius Casca. Most of them had never seen the original documentary, just references to it in academic papers. They treated it as an interesting case study in religious folklore, the kind of story that grows and changes with each retelling, accumulating miraculous elements and symbolic weight. A few tried to track down the scroll itself, searching records and interviewing church officials, but they found nothing. The location of the vault was known only to the highest levels of religious leadership, and those leaders weren't talking. One particularly persistent researcher, a young professor named Sarah Chen, managed to get Daniel's phone number and called him at home. He listened to her pitch about wanting to write a comprehensive book about the scroll, about the importance of making the testimony available to modern scholarship, about how much humanity could learn from an authentic eyewitness account of the crucifixion. When she finished, Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Dr. Chen, I'm going to tell you something, and I hope you'll hear it. I spent 4 months translating that scroll, and it nearly destroyed me. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I started having experiences that I still can't fully explain or rationalize. The priest who helped me fled to a monastery and took a vow of silence. Every generation that's encountered that testimony has experienced similar trauma. Not because the information is false, but because it's too true. Because it makes you feel what Gaius felt, makes you complicit in what he did, puts you there on that hill with the hammer in your hand. Some knowledge comes at too high a price. The scroll is sealed for good reason. It will remain sealed until 2125, and if the people alive then have any wisdom, they'll seal it for another century." Sarah Chen had published an article about a conversation with Daniel, framing it as an example of scholarly gatekeeping, of important historical documents being suppressed because they challenge established narratives. The article generated some discussion in academic circles, but ultimately changed nothing. The scroll remained sealed. The location remained secret. The burden remained contained. Daniel read the article and felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the ghost of the weight he'd carried while translating. He wrote a response, which he sent to the journal but never published publicly. "Dr. Chen accuses me of gatekeeping, of suppressing important historical evidence. Perhaps she's right, but I would ask her to consider this. Gaius Casca had the actual experience of being present at the crucifixion, of being the instrument of it, and that experience destroyed him so thoroughly that he lived for 40 years trying to make sense of it and died, having failed. I translated his account of that experience, several layers removed from the actual event, and it damaged me in ways I'm still processing 2 decades later. Dr. Chen wants full access to the testimony so she can write a book about it, which means she wants to experience what I experienced, what Gaius experienced, and she wants to package that experience and sell it to thousands of readers. She thinks this is scholarship. I think it's reckless. Some truths are too heavy to be treated as academic subjects. Some testimonies should remain sealed, not because they're false, but because they're too true, and truth without wisdom is just another form of violence." He never sent the letter. Instead, he filed it away with his other documents from that period, materials he'd been collecting, in a folder labelled simply Gaius. When he died, his children would find that folder and read through it, trying to understand what their father had experienced during those months he'd spent translating an ancient scroll. They would read his notes and his translations and his reflections, and they would feel a pale shadow of the weight he'd carried. One of them, his son, would have nightmares for weeks after reading the materials. His daughter would seal the folder and label it "Do Not Open" and place it in storage, understanding instinctively that some inheritances shouldn't be claimed. The vault beneath the Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained sealed. Guards changed shifts. Decades passed. The religious leaders who'd made the decision to contain the scroll died and were replaced by their successors, who knew of the vault's existence but had never been told its exact location. The knowledge was passed down through carefully controlled channels, each generation informed that something important rested beneath the church, something that should not be disturbed, something that required protection from those who would open it prematurely. Jerusalem continued its eternal dance of conflict and faith, pilgrims and politics, violence and holiness. The church above the vault filled each day with tourists and believers, people seeking connection to the sacred moment when, according to tradition, a man died and rose again, when divinity touched mortality and transformed it. They walked over the vault without knowing it was there, without knowing that beneath their feet rested one man's testimony about what that moment had actually been like, from the perspective of someone who'd held the hammer. In 2045, 20 years after the sealing, Dr. Daniel Ashford died in his sleep at the age of 62. The obituaries mentioned his distinguished career, his important discoveries, his dedication to teaching. A few mentioned the controversial documentary about the scroll of Gaius Casca, usually in the context of his later eccentric period, before he returned to more conventional scholarship. None of them mentioned the nightmares he'd had until his final year, the way he would sometimes wake in the night and stare at his hands as if seeing something there that no one else could see. His final journal entry, written the week before he died, contained a single observation. "I dreamed of Gaius last night. Not the nightmares of before, but something gentler. He was standing in sunlight, his hands clean, his face peaceful. He looked younger than in any description I translated, as if whatever burden he'd been carrying had finally been lifted. He nodded to me, just once, as if acknowledging that I'd done what needed to be done, that I protected his testimony from those who weren't ready for it, that I'd honoured his final wish for it to remain sealed. Then he was gone, and I woke feeling lighter than I've felt in 20 years. I think he knows his testimony is safe. I think, after 2,000 years of wandering in whatever place spirits go when they can't find rest, he can finally stop looking back at that hill and that afternoon, and those hands that held the hammer. I hope so. God, I hope so." Father Ephraim died in 2048 at age 93, still maintaining his vow of silence, still writing in journals that would be sealed away by his monastery's abbot. His final entry was shorter. I heard the voice again today, not frightening anymore, just sad, asking if anyone understood, asking if the burden was lifted. I cannot speak the answer, but I can write it. Yes, we understand. Yes, the burden is contained. Yes, you can rest now. Thank you for bearing witness, so we might learn the cost of it. The patriarch who had helped seal the scroll died in 2051. The archbishop followed in 2054. Rabbi Goldstein in 2040. Pastor Williams in 2062. One by one, the original witnesses to the sealing passed away, taking with them the specific memory of that Friday afternoon when they'd placed an ancient testimony in an ancient stone box and sealed it for a century. Their successors knew of the vault's existence, but had less personal connection to the decision. For them, it was tradition to be honoured, rather than trauma to be protected against. The years continued their steady march toward 2125. The world changed in ways both predictable and surprising. Technology advanced. Political systems rose and fell. Wars were fought, and peace was made, and wars were fought again. The scroll waited in darkness, patient as stone, heavy as history, carrying its burden of witness through time. And in 2075, 50 years after the sealing, something unexpected happened. A small earthquake, barely noticeable on the surface, caused a minor shift in the church's foundation. Engineers were called in to assess the damage and ensure the building's structural integrity. During their survey, one of them found the sealed chamber. It was clearly intentional, clearly protected, clearly important. They reported it to the church authorities, who consulted their records and realized what had been found. The current patriarch, a man who'd heard stories about the sealed testimony but had never expected to deal with it directly, gathered his fellow religious leaders in the same room where the decision to seal it had been made 50 years earlier. They had a choice. The seal had been compromised by the earthquake. They could take the opportunity to examine the scroll, to verify its condition, perhaps even to study it now that half a century had passed and perspectives had shifted. Or they could reseal it and wait for 2125 as originally planned. They debated for 3 days. Arguments were made on both sides. The opportunity to verify the scroll's condition was compelling. The chance to study it with modern technology even more so. Some argued that 50 years of cultural change had made humanity more prepared to handle traumatic testimony, that therapy and psychology had advanced to the point where the scroll's weight could be managed safely. Others disagreed. They pointed to the fact that wars still happened, that violence still marked human interactions, that the capacity for cruelty hadn't diminished despite technological advancement. They argued that if anything, modern society's constant exposure to images of suffering had numbed people to the point where they might engage with Gaius's testimony casually, without the psychological and spiritual preparation it required. In the end, they decided to reseal it. The vote was close, 7-5, but the decision was made. The chamber was reinforced, the seal was renewed. The date remained unchanged. April 15th, 2125. 100 years from the original sealing. Let that generation make its own choice with its own wisdom. The patriarch who made the final decision wrote a letter to his successor to be opened in 2125, explaining the reasoning: we chose to honor the wisdom of those who came before us. Dr. Daniel Ashford and his contemporaries made the decision to seal this testimony because they experienced its weight firsthand. We, who have only read their accounts of that weight, felt we had no authority to override their judgment. Perhaps in another 50 years, humanity will be ready, or perhaps they will make the same choice we have made. Either way, the responsibility passes to them as it was passed to us. The years continued. 2080, 2090, 2100. The world kept changing. Jerusalem remained eternal. New politics over ancient stones, modern conflicts, replaying ancient grudges. The sacred and profane mixing, as they always had in that city where three faiths claimed the same ground as holy. And beneath the church of the Holy Sepulchre, in the darkness and the silence, the scroll waited. Gaius Casca's testimony, his burden, his curse and his gift, his attempt across 40 years to make someone understand what it meant to be present at the moment when heaven touched earth and earth broke it, when divine love met human cruelty and absorbed it rather than reflecting it back, when one man died carrying the weight of humanity's collective sin, and the soldiers who killed him were forced to witness the full meaning of what they'd done. The scroll waited with the patience of testimony that had already waited 2,000 years. What was another century? What was another millennium? Truth doesn't expire. Trauma doesn't fade just because time passes. Witness doesn't diminish just because the witness is dead. The words remained, written in 3 languages, carrying the weight of one man's desperate attempt to share a burden he couldn't carry alone, but that proved too heavy for anyone else to bear. In 2124, 1 year before the seal was scheduled to be opened, the religious leaders, began meeting to discuss what would happen. Would they finally unseal it? Would they study it? Would they publish it? Would they seal it for another century? The decision weighed on them in ways they hadn't anticipated, and more than one of them experienced dreams about Roman soldiers and crosses and blood that wouldn't wash clean. The patriarch in 2124 was a woman, the first female to hold that position, a scholar of early Christianity who'd written extensively about martyrdom and witness. She'd read Daniel Ashford's documentary transcript as part of her doctoral research, had been fascinated by the testimony of Gaius Casca, had privately hoped that, when the seal was finally broken, she would be the one to lead the research. But the closer the date came, the more she understood why it had been sealed in the first place. She read Daniel's notes preserved in the church archives. She read Father Ephraim's journals. She read the historical accounts of what happened to every generation that had encountered this testimony. And she began to have doubts. She convened a meeting of religious leaders 3 months before the scheduled unsealing. In that same room beneath the church where the original decision had been made, she presented her findings and her concerns. Then she asked for a vote, open the seal as planned or extend it for another century. The debate that followed lasted 2 weeks. Scholars argued for opening it, citing humanity's right to know its own history. Psychologists warned about the potential trauma. Theologians discussed the theological implications of testimony that made readers complicit in divine murder. Historians weighed the value of a unique source against the cost of accessing it. In the end, they reached a compromise. The seal would be opened as planned on April 15th, 2125, but access would be strictly limited. A team of 3 scholars, chosen for their expertise and psychological stability, would examine the scroll under controlled conditions. They would have support from trauma therapists. They would work in short sessions with mandatory breaks. They would not be allowed to complete a full translation. They would simply verify its condition, document its contents photographically, and reseal it with their recommendations for future access. This decision was sealed in its own container, to be opened on April 15th, 2125. And there, finally, our story must end, because that date hasn't arrived yet. The scroll waits. The testimony waits. Gaius Casca's burden waits for another generation to decide what to do with it. But before we close, there is one final document to consider, a letter written by Daniel Ashford in the last year of his life, sealed and left with instructions that it be placed in the vault alongside the scroll to be opened by whoever unseals it. To whoever reads this, I'm Dr. Daniel Ashford. I discovered this scroll in 2025 and made the decision to seal it for 100 years. If you're reading this letter, then a century has passed, and you've decided to open the seal. I want you to understand what you're about to experience. Gaius Casca was present at the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. He was not a witness in the passive sense. He was the instrument. He drove the nails. He felt the hammer in his hand. He saw the prisoner's face looking up at him. He heard the words of forgiveness. And then he lived for 40 years trying to make sense of what that meant, what it felt like, what it did to him psychologically and spiritually. This scroll is his attempt to share that experience with you. And it will succeed. That's the problem. It won't just inform you about the crucifixion. It'll make you feel like you were there, like you held the hammer, like you were complicit, and that feeling will not leave you easily. It destroyed Gaius. It damaged me. It has harmed everyone who engaged deeply with it for 2,000 years. So, before you proceed, ask yourself, do you need to know this? Or do you just want to know it? Because there's a difference, and that difference matters. Some knowledge is necessary, even when it's painful. Some knowledge is just pain without purpose. I cannot tell you which category this falls into. That's a judgment you'll have to make for yourself. But I can tell you this. Gaius Casca spent 40 years wishing he could forget, and he never did. Consider carefully whether you want to spend the rest of your life carrying what he carried. May God grant you wisdom in your choice. Daniel Ashford, 2044. The letter waits alongside the scroll, the testimony waits, the burden waits, and in the darkness beneath Jerusalem, in a vault, sealed by those who understood the weight of witness, Gaius Casca's final attempt to make someone understand rests in stone and silence, patient as eternity, heavy as history, waiting for the day when humanity decides whether it's ready to bear what one Roman soldier carried for 40 years until it killed him. Some truths are too heavy, some memories too sharp, some moments too sacred and terrible to share. This is one of them, and now, having been warned, you must decide whether knowing that is enough, or whether you need to experience it for yourself. The scroll waits for your answer. It has waited 2,000 years. It can wait a little longer. The choice, as always, belongs to those who come after. May they choose more wisely than those who came before.